Colin Pitchfork, who you may recall, the double child killer and rapist, is to be released. Now, let me give you a little bit of background here. The double child killer and rapist Colin Pitchfork has been granted parole and will be released from prison. Pitchfork was jailed for life for raping and strangling two 15-year-old girls, Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, in Leicestershire. The parole board, in its decision, has said it determined that it was no longer necessary for the protection of the public for Mr. Pitchfork to remain confined, and thereby directed his release. I'll give you my thoughts on this in a minute. But first, I'm joined by Joseph Kotrie-Monson, criminal defence solicitor, who is director of Mary Monson Solicitors on Fleet Street, who specialises in serious crime. Very good evening to you, Joseph. Thank you for joining me. Do you understand why...
Good evening, Ali.
Very difficult time here. Do you understand why people might struggle to see individuals like Colin Pitchfork ever walking free?
Ali, we are sons, we are daughters, we are fathers, we are mothers. We hear stories like this. Everything is loaded. Feelings are strong. I'm a father myself. Who can blame? And in fact, the gentleman that we heard, the relative of poor Miss Ashworth, didn't he carry himself with a restrained dignity when he talked in those terms? It wasn't we want blood and torture. It was this should not be happening. And I have to say, on a human level, and indeed on a professional level, I have a great deal of sympathy for those sentiments. The likes of Pitchfork, here we are, in this glorious summer, just after 8 o'clock on a weekday night, talking about somebody who almost doesn't merit our consideration, does he, Ali?
Well, a lot of people would disagree with you, Joseph. I mean, you put it in a very calm manner, and I understand your particular point of view, and I also understand the point you're making about, rehabilitation. But do you think that it is possible to truly reform someone who did something so horrific?
I think it's a question for experts. It's a question for the law, and it's a question for the judge. In respect of this case, this sentence arose at the beginning of something that we now call minimum tariffs. Minimum sentences that have to be served by the time, Ali, that somebody can be even considered for release. And that was 30 years. We're now at 33 years in respect of Colin Pitchfork. I'm very reluctant to start pointing the finger at parole boards when they are given such a narrow choice, because their considerations are, given all that you know, given all the information and the evidence you're being provided, what can you say about whether, given this person has now served that minimum tariff, and they've already been turned down possibly twice, I think, given the fact this is the 33rd year of that sentence, or 34th year, that this person is not, and the test is very strict, a danger to the public.
But Joseph, they don't always get it right, though, do they?
No,
because I'm thinking of Jordan McSweeney, who murdered Zora Elena, who, as I understand it, was put on probation, was put out on parole rather, and went and committed the most heinous crime.
Yeah, and I think it's very, very difficult, because if the law is going to prescribe something, and we're not talking now about the parole board, we're talking about Parliament going forward. You can't retrospectively enforce laws about somebody who was sentenced 30 years ago. I doubt very much that would be a 30-year sentence now. I think the chances of a whole life term in such a case, given the way in which the public mood, as reflected by the way in which parliamentarians have acted, and the way in which judges now enforce or inflict sentences, I think probably we would have been looking at a different sentence. And in that regard, sadly, I think we're probably looking in a fair society where there's a principle that you're sentenced to the law as it is at the time you're sentenced. Well, in those circumstances, we're probably looking back in time to some extent, and it may well be that we can reflect that there has been some progress as far as reflecting the popular sentiment in that regard.
Joseph, can I just clarify? Just because I'm not a legal expert, but you are, so I just want to clarify this point. Are you saying that things have got tougher or less tough as time has
definitely
progressed?
tougher, definitely
Okay.
tougher. And this is the type of sentence that I'm certain, if it had been passed in the modern age, the Attorney General on behalf of the state, the government, and a legal officer of government would have had this referred to the High Court, and the sentence would have been increased. So I'm not always a great defender of our system and all its flaws, but I have to say, Ali, that that I think that we should resist the temptation, even in this terrible and emotive case. We should resist the temptation for assuming that this is a flaw in the current system. The judge's comments at the time will have been taken into account, and the evidence available to the parole board. I also think it's tempting, but ultimately unhelpful, although I don't criticize anybody who does, especially families and friends, to criticize the job of the parole board, who have a tremendously difficult job.
Of course. Can I just ask you one final question, Joseph, which is it correct, I just want to clarify this with you, that the Justice Secretary could veto a decision of the parole board if they so wish?
That's right. Secretary of State can intervene. Now they must show a high standard. They must, the test summarized is one of irrationality. So it must go beyond the discretion of the parole board, who have access to all of the different information. Ali, all the different information relating to the previous refusals as to why parole was not granted, and say this is, to the standard, as some lawyers say, Wednesbury unreasonableness. It's so crazy that no tribunal could have come to that decision. It's a high bar, and the principle is that these officers, these people carrying out this statutory duty in the parole board, should not, on the basis merely of a headline and some, temporary public sentiment, be vulnerable to criticism.
Yes, understood. Thank you very much indeed. That was Joseph Kotrie-Monson, a criminal defence solicitor, director of Mary Monson Solicitors, joining me this evening.